Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Now today we're going to be talking about one of the more interesting aspects of the Clone Wars, and that's armored warfare. But instead of just talking about in-universe vehicles and battles, we'll be taking a look at what we know about armored warfare in our own history, and applying that knowledge to the Grand Army of the Republic and Confederacy of Independent Systems' own armor doctrine. The first armored tanks used in World War I were designed to be used in the cratered no-man's land of the Western Front in between Germany and France. Thanks to non-stop shelling, most of the vegetation in these landscapes were gone, and all that was left were muddy fields lined with barbed wires and long trenches. The terrain was already quite difficult for infantrymen to move on foot, let alone for one of the new mechanical horses that had just been invented before the turn of the century. Now, there had been some earlier attempts to create armored cars for the battlefield, like the Ostro-Daimler four-wheel drive armored car, but the power and off-road capability of these vehicles was quite limited and certainly useless in the muddy terrain in France. Which is why the first official tanks, or landships as they were called, had to be capable of maneuvering through this kind of difficult terrain. The British Mark I landship would be the first tank to see combat in World War I, and it had been directly inspired by tractors that were used to haul heavy artillery across the battlefield. Continuous tracks were a great choice for a tank platform because they had a much larger surface area in contact with the ground, which allowed the weight of the vehicle to be spread more evenly across the ground. Now, most treads in those days were also made out of metal, making them more durable than rubber tires. At the Battle of Somme, British Mark I tanks took the field, and the ones that didn't break down did indeed strike fear in the enemy lines and marched across the battlefield, climbing over craters and trenches. And so from this day forward, most armored tanks would use this type of locomotion. Now in the Clone Wars, we have two very different types of main battle tanks. First, there's the Republic All-Terrain Tactical Enforcer with its 6 independently articulating mechanical legs. Then there's the Separatist Armored Assault Tank platform, which uses a repulsor lift propulsion system. It's interesting that in Star Wars we see this avoidance of tracked vehicles. Obviously, both factions in Star Wars are far more advanced technologically than our own world. But the ATTE and AAT, despite their advanced technology, are actually quite slow. The AAT, despite having no friction with the ground, only has a top speed of around 55 kilometers per hour. The ATTE was surprisingly faster with a top speed of 60 kilometers per hour. The first generation M1 Abrams main battle tank could actually hit a top speed of 72 kilometers per hour, and the Russian T-80 could also hit around similar top speeds. Now, the ATTE and AAT had their own specific weaknesses and advantages due to their propulsion method. The ATTE's 6 articulating legs could climb up vertical surfaces, something that neither tracked vehicles nor hovering vehicles could ever hope to replicate. But at the same time, these legs were vulnerable to explosives, and even losing one could severely hamper the maneuverability of the ATTE. The AAT used anti-gravity power, so it could travel over large bodies of water without too much difficulty, something that the two other platforms could not. This would make an obstacle like a river not be much of a problem for the Separatist Alliance armored forces. Since the beginning of time, humans have sought to protect themselves in warfare, first by using shields and then covering their bodies with protective materials. When humans learned how to harness the awesome power of animals, they would also armor those animals and anything they pulled into battle. Now, each advancement in armor would increase the weight and decrease the mobility of each fighter. This would be a pattern we would see go on throughout the rest of history. There's always kind of a trade-off. Now, as terrifying as these first tanks were during World War I, they weren't extremely reliable and also were susceptible to enemy fire. They were also very slow. The first Mark I tanks used at the Battle of Somme, for instance, had extremely thin armor to the sides, which allowed some small arms fire to penetrate them. Also, as tanks became more popular, so did anti-tank rifles, which fired large 13mm rounds that could penetrate frontal tank armor. Even more terrifying for a tank was enemy artillery, which could easily destroy any tank with one shot. One of the first tanks deployed by the French in World War I was the Schneider. During the Nivelle Offensive on April 16, 1917, 128 Schneider tanks assaulted enemy lines alongside French infantry. More than 76 of them had been knocked out. Like most tanks of the era, the Schneider moved at a really slow pace of around 5 miles per hour, and more importantly, routinely got stuck in the mud. Their large size and heavy weight made them essentially sitting ducks for German artillery. Arguably one of the most successful and modern tanks to see combat in World War I was the Renault FT-17. Not only did it have a rotating turret like those found on battleships, it was much lighter and more nimble. It was also cheaper to build and required only 2 crew members, a driver and a gunner. It was also able to traverse over more varied terrain and much less likely to get stuck. The French would actually swarm enemy defenses with a large number of these very light tanks in a very blitzkrieg-esque style. Now, a quick look at the ATTE, and we find that the vehicle itself is not particularly fast or necessarily heavily armored. Unlike modern tanks here on Earth, the ATTE lacks reactive armor, and they also aren't deployed with deflector shields like you might see on a Star Wars capital ship. This actually makes them quite vulnerable to attack. On top of that, the ATTE had a massive profile thanks to its long legs, which raised it off the ground. Since most Star Wars weapons are line-of-sight weapons, this makes it a pretty big design flaw. What's even more strange is the Empire will eventually upgrade the ATTE into the AT-AT Walker, which is even higher. It's said that this higher height was supposed to protect the Walker better from landmines, although with only 4 legs, if one of those legs is destroyed by a landmine, the collapse of such a high Walker could be even more deadly. The Separatist AAT also suffered from similar problems. It was slow, heavy, and it also was kind of tall and had a larger profile. It also lacked any type of advanced defenses. But the AAT also goes into battle with the IG-227 Hailfire class droid and the NRN-99 Persuader class droid. Both are tracked or wheeled vehicles and have considerably faster top speeds. The Persuader class tank can not only travel at 100 kilometers per hour, it also could traverse over water, making it quite a versatile and fast vehicle. When you're mainly dealing with direct line of fire weapons, it's very important how the turret is designed. During the Yom Kippur War, outgunned Israeli tankers and heavily modified World War II era Centurion tanks were able to hold off a much more modern Syrian tank fleet of T-55s. Zvi Greengold, an Israeli tank ace, was able to stop an entire column of Syrian tanks with just 1 Centurion tank platoon. Not only was he an incredibly skilled and brave tanker, the Israeli Centurion tanks could depress and raise its main gun far more than the T-55. The T-55 did feature an extremely low-profile turret, which made it harder to hit, but that also limited how many degrees the main gun could depress. This made it much harder for the T-55 to engage tanks at different elevations. If we take a look at the ATTE versus the AAT, there are similar advantages and disadvantages. While the ATTE's main gunner is more exposed, the turret also has the ability to depress and raise itself far more than the AAT. This is partly thanks to the mechanical legs, which can bend and raise the entire platform. The AAT's main turret has problems depressing thanks to its layout above and behind the main fuselage of the tank. Still, both of these tanks do feature spinning turrets that can revolve a full 180, which makes them a lot more effective than the Persuader class tank's fixed guns. When a tank has fixed guns, it requires the entire tank to swivel around in order to line up a shot. Tanks are usually pretty expensive to research, build, and maintain, and no matter how well you protect them, they're still going to be vulnerable to anti-tank crews either on foot or using fixed weapons emplacements. This becomes especially apparent in an urban battlefield where a tank's field of view and line of sight is severely limited. In these kind of scenarios, enemy combatants can use the verticality of urban landscapes to approach a tank's weak spot undetected. Now, the ATTE is purpose-built as not only a tank, but also a troop carrier. This makes it not only the Republic's main battle tank, but also their main infantry fighting vehicle. The ATTE also has several smaller anti-personnel swivel turrets around its entire body, which can provide the vehicle with 360-degree protection against anti-tank crews on foot. Screening your armored vehicles with infantry and weapons emplacements is key to the survival of your armored vehicles in an urban environment. In 1994, the Russian army invaded the Chechen capital of Grozny with several armored columns supported by poorly trained conscripts. These troops were not trained in urban combat or combined arms maneuvers and were expecting the Chechens to be intimidated into submission by the massive tank columns. Most of the Russian conscripts rode into battle sitting on top of their tanks instead of fanning out and screening the armored columns in advance. Meanwhile, highly motivated Chechen irregulars, many of whom had experience fighting in the Russian army or Soviet army before it, were organized in small hunter-killer squads armed with handheld anti-tank weapons. What resulted was a massacre for the Russian army. The first armored column alone lost 105 of its 120 tanks and armored personnel carriers, with the entire force losing over 400 armored vehicles in just one day. On top of that, entire battalions of infantry soldiers had simply just been wiped out and disappeared. Even most of the feared attached Spetsnaz units involved in the battle had been captured by Chechenian irregulars. This shows us that armor, when not properly used, can lead to disastrous results. The Russian tanks had problems tracking targets with their slower turrets and couldn't really hit snipers and anti-tank teams that were hidden below or above street level. The Chechen hunter-killer teams knew that these armored vehicles usually had thinner armor on top of the turrets and usually targeted these tanks from higher angles. So in order to allow armor to function properly in an urban area, you also need competent infantry soldiers. The clones have proved to be very efficient at what they do and are skilled in combined arms maneuvers. The B-1 and B-2 battle droids used to protect the separatist AATs in urban environments are far less capable and better suited for larger open field battles like what we see during the Naboo Crisis or the Battle of Geonosis. The AAT also lacks a substantial amount of anti-personnel weapons, which will further increase its need for infantry support. So there you have it, guys. Those are some lessons we can learn from armored warfare here on Earth applied to Star Wars. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button. And as usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.